Hello and welcome to yet another edition of E-Expressions with the New Indian Express. I have with me Ambassador to the US between 2009 and 2011, Ambassador Meera Shankar. Hi, ma'am. Good to see you here.
Good to be here, Kaveri.
And we have Dr. Sriram Cholia, who's Executive Director of the Center for Global Governance and Policy at OP Jindal Global University. Hello, Professor. Good to have you here with us.
Hi, thank you. Honor to be with you.
So, Ambassador, of course, I'd like to start with you because you've had personal experience of the Obama Biden administration, and the Biden Harris ticket is really the news of the moment. Everyone's quite excited about owning Kamala Harris as quickly as possible and making her Indian. But apart from that, it sort of energized the general election, and it's created a great amount of global excitement. Not just because she's a woman, but also because she's black and Indian. So the Biden Harris ticket suddenly looks very exciting. Master, I'd like to ask you because you've had personal experience of the administration. And in fact, in your earlier stint, you had experience of Bush Sr. as well as Clinton. So you've seen the Democrats as well as the Republicans in power at the White House. So really, what is your take on this new move?
Well, first of all, I think it's energized the campaign.
Yeah.
While Biden was still ahead in the polls, but it was seen as more of a anything but Trump vote.
Right.
Really, not so much enthusiasm about Biden's own candidacy. Now, with Kamala Harris being on the vice presidential ticket, this is historic because, as you said, she's a woman of color. These two make it a historic bid, and that has energized the electorate. In fact, CNN's latest poll shows that, well near 75% of the American electorate is very enthused about voting in this election, which is quite an increase from the earlier somewhat apathetic response. Two, I think the interesting thing is that 52% to 54%, there are two polls, one says 52%, one says 54% of people in America feel that Kamala Harris is ready to be president. That she is capable of being president, because that could be a doubt, given the fact that the vice presidency is just a breath away from the presidency, and given Biden's age, I think people will weigh in this factor. Is this person ready to assume the presidency? Should anything happen? It may never happen, but should anything happen, will this person be ready to assume the presidency? And there we are seeing that a majority do say that she is ready and she's prepared to be president. Biden himself is leading in the polls, national polls. If you look at the poll of polls, that is, which kind of aggregates all the recent polls, it's about a 9% lead at the national level. But I would still say that the election is not an open and shut case, because if you look at the last vote, Hillary won 3 million more votes than Trump as far as the national popular vote went. But in the electoral college, which evens out the voting rights and the seats of each state, Trump took the swing states, and that made all the difference, and he won the election. Now, in the swing states, there are at the moment about 15 battleground states. But in some of those swing states, Biden is ahead, including Pennsylvania, Michigan, and surprisingly Florida. Some polls show also in Arizona. But his lead in these is not beyond the margin of error. It's very, very narrow. It's like a 4% or 5%. In Arizona, 1% ahead of Trump. In Florida, because of the pensioners, actually, the older people who've migrated to Florida and their concern over the pandemic and Trump's handling of it, opinion has shifted because Florida has traditionally been a conservative state with the Cuban Americans generally voting Republican by large numbers. So that would be a shift, as would Arizona, which has traditionally been Republican, but it's just 1%.
Right.
So it's well within the margin of error. And it means that which way the swing states are going to go is undecided.
Right.
Trump's own approval ratings remain pretty steady. He has neither been able to increase them, nor have they decreased very significantly. It's still about 42% or 43% going by different polls. And that means that his constituency is rock solid. There are some conservative Republicans who are now actually campaigning against Trump. That is the interesting thing.
Yeah.
In this, in the Democratic Convention, the first day of which you had Michelle Obama speaking, and you had, Governor Cuomo speaking, and then you had John Kasich, the Republican former governor, who has basically said anyone but Trump, never Trump. This is their campaign. And there are a number of traditional conservative Republicans, particularly of the Bush era, who are campaigning pretty aggressively against Trump, including a project called the Lincoln Project, which is taking out some pretty hard-hitting ads against Trump, and these are traditional Republicans. But if you actually see Trump's hold on the Republican Party, which has to some extent been recast in Trump's mold,
Right.
his hold over the party still remains pretty rock solid in Congress and even in the constituencies. But his problem has been extending his support beyond the 42%.
Yeah.
To get the, independents and swing voters. Last time he had got a sufficient number of independents and also suburban voters to swing towards his side. Whether that will happen this time remains in question. And Biden's strategy is to position himself as centrist, not the radical left of the party, which Trump has been trying to paint them as. These are anarchists, these are communists, and they're going to, take the country down the road of perdition to socialism and communism and so on. So he's positioning himself as centrist, and Kamala Harris is herself a centrist with experience in law and order and the administration of justice. And she was seen as a tough on crime attorney general in California, and indeed has been criticized by some liberals on that account.
Yes.
Biden is also positioning himself as a unifier, because the Democrats have been driven by this debate between the traditional mainstream and the new upcoming, more radical, younger forces, which have been trying to pull the party more leftward. And Biden, by getting Sanders' unqualified support, I think is positioning himself as somebody who will be a unifier of the Democratic Party. Now, if you look at Sanders' own behavior, he is pitching for Biden in a way in which he never pitched for Hillary.
Hillary, exactly.
And, he's saying that, the future of democracy, we have to get out and support Biden because the future of democracy is at stake, the future of the economy is at stake, and the future of our planet is at stake. And the interesting thing is that if you look at Biden, he is making a pitch for restoration of decency, for a restoration of the values that America stands for, and for America's respect in the world. If you look You want me to go into his foreign policy agenda right now or later?
We'll come to, yeah, we'll come to that later. But Ambassador, I'd also like to, before I go to Professor Chole, I'd also like to ask you at a personal level, how is it to work with Vice President Biden? How was it to work with him? And what is his personal view of India?
Well, I think he was extremely congenial. I mean, if he had a competition for Mr. Congeniality,
oh, yes.
he would certainly win it. He's very congenial. He has a long history of chairing the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or being a ranking member on the committee. Therefore, he learned to work across the aisle with Senate Republicans as well, and has also chaired the Judiciary Committee. These are the two committees which he's chaired. He's known as very honest, and in fact had to sell his house for the treatment of his son Bo, who died of cancer. And this is why.
And that made him even more sort of acceptable to a lot of people. You know, it made him more humane. Seem more humane.
Yes, and he is blue collar. You know, so he appeals to the working class white American vote which Hillary had lost.
Exactly.
He was always extremely cordial. And in fact, when I remember when I met him for the second time at a somewhat large conference where there were many people present, and I was taken to meet him, and he said, "Oh, Madam Ambassador, you are the most important person in this room." And I thank you, Mr. Vice President. That's very gracious of you to say it, even though I know it's not true. So he started laughing, but he's very cordial. And able to work with people. You know, he's able to work with people. Overall, I found him positive on India. And as in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he helped to muster the Democrats in favor of the nuclear deal with President George Bush was pushing at that time. So overall, I would say he's had long experience in foreign policy and has a positive attitude to India. He's also put, that there's the upholding and strengthening of democratic values and, freedoms, individual freedoms also, as one of the big items on the agenda of his foreign policy. And he plans to convene a conference of democracies in the first year of his governance to try to take this idea forward. So overall, I would say that he's very pleasant and very congenial, easy to deal with. I mean, you're not going to get the unfiltered
responses of President Trump.
And there will be more predictability. He's far more predictable, more cautious, mainstream.
Have you had the opportunity to meet Kamala Harris, ma'am?
Only in a large gathering. Not really, because she was in California, which is the other end of the US. I did meet her, but in a large gathering where I was meeting a number of governors and other, state level officials. She's certainly sharp. She's, has this prosecutorial ability, which you've seen on display in the Senate, with pointed and persistent, not rude, but it's pointed and persistent questioning of Justice Kavanaugh and several of the other Republican officials, including then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Beyond that, she and her family have identified very closely with the civil rights movement, because that is when her mother first went to
America.
States, and also with her Black heritage from her Jamaican father. So she studied at Howard University, which is a Black university in Washington, D.C., very much cementing her Black connections. And And she's endorsed by the Black Caucus, the African American caucus in the Congress, as the vice presidential candidate. And they did lobby for her also with President Biden. So she straddles two communities.
Yeah.
You know, on the one hand, but her social experience in the US, where you tend to get identified by how you look externally, is Black. Like if you take a look at President Obama,
Yeah.
he was brought up, his mother was white,
Right.
was brought up by his mother and by his grandparents who were traditional, mainstream white Americans.
Right.
But his identity is Black because that is the identity which mainstream America actually accepts for him because he looks Black.
Right.
So I think with Kamla also, to some extent, it's this. It's also that that's more of the mainstream of America.
Yeah.
And she wanted to probably be, and her mother also, in the mainstream of the American, polity and society.
A very exciting time, isn't it? I mean, and in a way, it gives Indians a way in. I mean, an emotional connect to her. Whether we, of course, we love to appropriate anyone, even remotely Indian, but it's just that it gives us an emotional investment in the election and an added investment. Professor Cholia, may I bring you in here and ask you about the impact that you think it will have on Trump's possible re-election? Do you think it's likely that he will be re-elected, especially given his handling of the pandemic?
Well, Kaveri, Trump has made huge blunders this year. He was sailing comfortably for a second term, at least until February, March.
Right.
His approval ratings were almost 49%, which is the highest in his entire career, presidential career. So he blew it. I mean, the problem is that, he was callous and he was in a denial mode and he kept on saying jobs, economy, stock market, all those things, while people were dying like flies. So, and I think that set him back, because now he has neither the stock market or jobs to crow about, nor does he have a successful record in saving lives from the pandemic. So I think, in a way, Donald Trump is like Destiny's Child. I mean, he barely won in 2016. Like Ambassador Meera Shankar was saying, he lost the popular vote and still he made it because he was lucky in many ways. It was by a whisker. And this time he can call himself unlucky because had the pandemic not happened, I mean, just to do a counterfactual, I think he would have still been a front runner. Because if you do a matchup one-on-one at the level of the candidates, of course, Kamala Harris is very impressive, but that's a different thing. I'm talking about the presidential candidates. I mean, Biden, for all his charm, is, gaffe prone. He's slow off the blocks.
He's groping prone.
Yeah, well, there have been some scandals, but Trump is not a saint either.
Exactly.
But, when it comes to
worse.
Yeah.
What
worse parts of the anatomy that we cannot talk about.
Worse. On sexism, much worse. But what I'm saying is, Trump is like a street brawler, right? I mean, he gets down really nasty and ugly and he takes it, he fights. And I don't think Biden has that capacity. So had the pandemic not, and in fact, that's the interesting part. If you see the opinion polls now, yes, Biden is leading, but a lot of people are saying it's not because they like him. It's just because Trump has messed up, the double-digit unemployment suddenly, and no way out of the hole to dig themselves out of the hole that's happened in the last 6 months. So it's like a black swan event that came out of nowhere and seems to be blowing away Trump. But still, we can't count him out for reasons Ambassador Meera Shankar mentioned, and for reasons we know well. The ones who don't have college education and the ones who are in rural areas, white voters, are his base, and they have not gone away from him. So it's a question of independence here and there, and Trump is still counting on some kind of a modest rebound in the economy in the next 3 months, which he can then take to November 3rd saying, look, I'm overseeing a recovery. And in a 6 months we'll be back to the boom years until as it was until early 2020 before the pandemic. So he's like going to be trying to sell that, and he will be very aggressive. He'll use race a lot. He'll use immigration a lot. He's going to use a lot of China bashing, which we don't mind. But Biden's China criticism probably is better because it's more systematic and sophisticated. But for Trump, it's going to be like, all kid gloves are off now. So that sense, it's raw, and he's going to try and play on emotions more viscerally. And I think he will try to use the majoritarian sentiment against Harris also, you see, because the fact that she's vice president, could become president, can repel some white voters, including some right of center white voters, So he's going to use all those things. But if you are a rational voter and you look at the state of the comatose economy and the massive deaths and infections, obviously you'll go for Biden. So I think if you vote with head, then a lot of people, including white people, are going to vote for Biden. So if there was an election today, I think surely Democrats are going to win. But 3 months is like a lifetime in politics, and you never know. There are people talk in American election history about October surprise. Trump has been rather isolationist and has avoided interventions around the world. But what if he's in desperation launches a strike against China or Iran and tries to rally people around the flag and around the presidency? Anything can happen. So I think Trump is desperate, and when a populist is desperate, anything can happen.
What about the deal with yes, sorry, Master Shankar, what was
not to mention the postal ballots?
Yes.
Yeah, of course they'll look to tamper, and it's going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly, and it's going to be like, and who knows, people say that Trump, if he's defeated, he won't even accept the verdict, and he remains in office as per the American system even after losing for nearly 2 months. There is a transition to a new administration, and Trump remains kind of a lame duck president. So anything can happen. I'll only say that this is not a normal time. This is a Great Depression. America is in a Great Depression. There could be war. There could be some kind of version to fascism. There could be more racial violence and riots on the streets. It's like a cauldron right now. So somehow the decency and the softness and the sophistication and elite approach of Biden, Harris ticket, may not work when people are so desperate and angry and they're looking to channel their negative energies. So don't count out Trump, but I would still say he is not the favorite.
Master Shankar, interesting points being made about the impact domestically. What about the Biden-Harris foreign policy? How do you see that panning out? Because when Trump was in power, there was absolute disruption. There was no such thing as a foreign policy. I think it depended on what he tweeted or how he reacted emotionally to personally to leaders. For instance, to Prime Minister Modi seemed to have a great equation with him. How do you see that changing with Biden and Harris?
Look, as far as the foreign policy is concerned, I think Biden wants to restore a semblance of order to their foreign policy. And he calls it dignity and respect also for America's leadership in the world. There are several aspects of foreign policy. He's going to stress on rebuilding the alliance system, which Trump upended, particularly with NATO.
Right.
Trump has been virtually dismissive of the Europeans, if not positively hostile to them, almost treating them as adversaries in the economic field, particularly
except to Macron's wife, perhaps.
Yes. But Biden says he's going to restore the alliance system and also reimagine it for the future. As far as Asia is concerned, he's talked of strengthening relations with traditional allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. and other Asian democracies. Separately, in a Independence Day greeting to the Indian American community, he has touched many of the key points which are of concern to Indian Americans. He would be more liberal on immigration. B, he would do away with country quotas on green cards, because right now Indians face almost 100-year wait before green cards are going to be processed if you go by country quotas. So by doing away with that, he will hasten the process of giving citizenship to green card holders of Indian origin who have such a backlog piled up. He has talked of restoring the permission for students to work, so that would make the US again a more attractive place for Indian students, because more have been going to other countries like Australia or Canada or the UK, because Johnson has restored this.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think by doing that, America would we have about 200,000 students traditionally in the US, but it's been coming down in recent years. As far as the H-1B is concerned, little ambiguous, but better than Trump, because Trump had suspended the H-1B visas till December and the L-1 visas, so making it impossible for our companies to take software experts from India to the US for purposes of their business. As it is over the last 4 years of Trump, the processing of the H-1B visas had become far more difficult for Indian companies. And indeed, with the suspension of the visas altogether, companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, the American biggies have been lobbying, saying that this makes business extremely difficult, and been lobbying for a change. So Biden says he will reform, he will restore, but reform the H-1B visa process to protect workers' rights. Now, what that means, we don't really know. Will it mean raising the minimum wage ceiling for H-1Bs, etc.? But he is not talking of suspending the H-1 and L-1 visa program altogether. He has, on terrorism, reiterated that they will be against terrorism, stand with India against terrorism, including cross-border terrorism of any variety, and has also talked of standing with India in its disputes, including border disputes, which is something quite new, and obviously said with the context of the Chinese intrusions in mind. So overall, in this, in his Independence Day speech, I would say Biden was trying to press all the right buttons as far as the Indian American community is concerned, because some of the community and some elements in India also have been expressing concern about Kamala Harris, because she had commented on Pramila Jayapal not being allowed to attend the foreign ministers' meeting, and also has made statements on Kashmir. But I think those are things we have navigated in the past. And in fact, when I was there, I was mentioning that despite the stone throwing and the worst of the, stone throwing agitations.
Yeah, it was in 2010.
Yes. They didn't make any statement of it. I was able to go and explain to them and to say that, it was a change of tactic, and whenever there was a General Assembly or an impending visit by a US dignitary, there was this effort to kind of mobilize the civil, the human rights agenda by having recourse to these kind of methods, knowing that terrorism evokes, criticism. So this was actually accepted. And if you recall, when the Obama administration first came in, Obama had made one statement on Kashmir first, when he was very, very new. And then there was some effort also by their, interlocutor or their ambassador on Afghanistan to try to get Kashmir along with Afghanistan and Pakistan as part of his portfolio.
Right.
But we were able to talk to the White House, and that was kept off his portfolio completely. And then every time he used to meet me, he used to say, I'm not even going to mention I'm not even going to mention the K word.
K word. Right.
So
Yes. Yeah.
there's a platform which they have traditionally, which is more upfront on human rights. And this is what I keep saying, that there is a bipartisan consensus to strengthen the relationship with India. Now, within that broad consensus, driven by strategic factors and concerns over China's challenge in Asia with its aggressive behavior, there are differences in nuance in terms of what they emphasize at one point or the other. I mean, Trump has hit us very badly on the economic front, despite, his being embraced as a great friend of India.
Right.
The GSP has been withdrawn. The designation of India as a developing country was withdrawn.
Right.
The H-1B visas were made so difficult and eventually suspended altogether. The work visas for students have been withdrawn.
Right.
The visas for spouses of H-1B visa holders to work have been withdrawn. So if you look at it, he's kicked you hard in the stomach where it hurts.
Yeah.
So it's a question of, what you prioritize. Do you prioritize bread and butter and economics? And is that really tangible hurt compared to, statements and so on, which continue and which as an embassy and a country we have learned to handle?
Right. But Ambassador, it has also been the work of diplomats such as you over 2 decades, really, to mend this relationship, which was indeed at one point quite fractious. And always, this hyphenation with Pakistan, which used to bother India so much, and the linking, therefore, of Kashmir. So this de-hyphenation, in fact, has been the work of diplomats such as you. How was it during the Trump era? I know you were not there, but what did you hear and about the relationship between the embassy and the White House in the Trump era? Because of course we saw the relationship between Modi and Trump, but we didn't know what went into the background.
Look, I think there were two developments really which set the stage for re-looking and resetting the whole Indo-US relationship in the 90s.
Right.
One was the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And the second was the opening up of the Indian economy.
Right.
This liberalization meant that India became a much more, significant partner for the United States in terms of the economic relationship, even though we are the 9th largest partner for us. But prior to that, when it was a closed economy, there was hardly any possibility of trade, commerce, or investment. Once the liberalization took place, that happened. And with the end of the Cold War, we were able to overcome our differences, which had arisen because of our non-aligned stance during the Cold War between the two blocs. And the two blocs themselves collapsed. This, was no longer a factor. And then a series of decisions by leaders on both sides and by diplomats. And we have moved from, what was called, to actually what I think Dennis Cox described us as, estranged democracies. And now we have moved to being engaged democracies. So I think this is the work cumulatively of administrations on both sides, whether it was Clinton or it was Bush or it was Obama or it was Trump, and also officials on both sides who had to learn new ways of dealing with each other and overcome their past prejudices and suspicions. Those persisted. on both sides for some time after the collapse of the Cold War, but it was the economic relationship which took off first under Narasimha Rao. And then I think gradually we were able to deal with the residual suspicion in the political aspects of the relationship. And then eventually move towards strategic convergence in terms of both terrorism as well as maritime security, as well as the challenge posed maritime security in the Asia Pacific, as well as the challenge posed by China. Right. Of course, it doesn't mean that we agree on everything. We have our differences. We are a developing country, so our positions on many global issues are at divergence with those of the US on some of these global issues. But we've learned to talk about these in a more mature manner. And we have also learned not to let these become the touchstone of the entire relationship, because there are other factors which bring us together. Now, if you see Biden, it's quite interesting. He has said on day one, he will rejoin the Paris Accord on climate change. Right. And he will convene a conference of key emitters to see if they can be persuaded to be more ambitious about targets beyond what they have already committed. He himself wants to commit America to steps to achieving zero carbon emissions by 2050. The other interesting thing is Iran, where he has said that he will, if Iran is willing to come back into compliance with the nuclear deal, he is willing to rejoin the nuclear agreement from which Trump had walked out. Now, this gives the US more options in the Middle East. And he's also said that he will stop support for the Saudi war in Yemen. Withdraw troops from Afghanistan and the Middle East. So that would be more or less a continuum with Trump, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and the Middle East. Stopping support for the Saudi war in Yemen would be a departure from Trump. And rejoining the Iran nuclear agreement would be 360 degrees, opposite to what Trump has done. At the time that Obama was negotiating this with Iran, the US was looking at something which also perhaps embraced Iran's missile program and its regional behavior. But then they found that that wouldn't fly, and they felt that halting and delaying Iran's nuclear program was of such critical importance that doing the nuclear deal as a standalone would be the better course. And that if they did the nuclear deal and it held, then the gradual confidence and trust which would build up on both sides would make the other issues of moderating Iran's behavior perhaps easier for the US to handle. And so at that time, the Obama administration, because the Republicans were blocking the withdrawal of sanctions through legislation since they controlled a majority in the Senate. So Obama was trying to give Iran what he could by way of executive action without those sanctions being withdrawn. And they were pressing us, saying, move quickly with Iran. They should get they should see rewards coming to them quickly. We are telling both the Europeans and the countries like you to move quickly with Iran. And then you had the Trump administration which said, with Iran, we will put sanctions on you. So on some of the areas where we've had differences or divergences with the US, I think a more moderate policy by Biden might erode some of these differences, as on Iran, especially now that Iran is virtually going the China way, given that they've been driven into a corner by the US and the unwillingness of countries to really take on the US and bear US sanctions for trading with Iran, including the Europeans who go by the deal, but their companies are not willing to trade or deal with Iran because they fear US sanctions.
Professor Tolya, may I just bring you in here quickly and talk about the rise of the Indian American voter as, of course, a consequence of the rise of the Indian American community as well. As Ambassador Shankar mentioned, the liberalization and I think the increasing prominence of Indian Americans across corporate America, cultural America, that has also played a key role. What do you think of the Indian American voter in these elections?
Well, traditionally they have leaned heavily Democratic, and I think almost 3/4 of them voted for Hillary Clinton last time in 2016.
Right.
But Trump has built a constituency with a lot of conservative Indian Americans.
Right.
They may not be a majority of the Indian American community, but they're there. And increasingly, I mean, one hears that, for example, Trump campaign is targeting Hindu Americans.
Yes. And I believe Muslims and Sikhs.
Yeah. So they are taking a kind of a granular approach now.
Right.
Because obviously 1.3 million voters is, I mean, if it is going to be very close in some of the swing states, then, every few thousand votes will matter. So I think both parties are going to vie for them. And especially in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas, Ohio, the places where there could be, it's like touch and go. So I think in a sense, they will be finding themselves more, valorized as a voting group than before, because in percentage terms, they're still small. It's like, all the Asian Americans, including Indians, Koreans, Vietnamese, Filipinos, Chinese, and the Pacific Islanders, just 3 to 4% of the electorate. I mean, compared to the African Americans, which is 12%, Hispanics, another 12 to 13%, they're much smaller group. But, where the margins are small, they could be handy. So I think they're going to be a lot of efforts to get them on either side. And it will be for their own betterment because, your ability to bargain as an ethnic minority group in a large melting pot increases if your electoral strength rises. And of course, I don't expect all of them to vote Democratic this time. The polls still suggest that many of them will go with the Biden-Harris campaign. Kamala Harris may be an added attraction, may wean away some centrist Indian Americans to the Democrats. But I think there is also a fervent, and you see, if you go down south, Texas, Arizona, Florida, these states, Georgia, you find a lot of Indian Americans who are in the oil and gas sector, for example, who benefited from Trump's campaign, from Trump's policies of the last 4 years. So it's all, fossil fuels and, forget the environment. So deregulation, tax, breaks, all these things help them. So they're mobilizing, and some of them could be big donors also. So it's not only the votes, it's also the money, and there's like a frantic race to raise more and more funds in the next 2.5 months. So and there'll be the super PACs and all these things through which the parties generate huge wealth for campaigning. So all those things will matter. So I think Indian Americans are sitting pretty. I don't think, the H-1B and all those did not apply to them because this was for fresh people off the board coming from India, right? These are American citizens now, naturalized citizens who have the vote there. So Trump did not, go after them very much. I mean, there was this whole anti-minority slant in many of his policies, but that was largely directed at immigrants from Latin America and against African Americans in the name of law and order. So Indian Americans have not really borne the brunt of any kind of like severe or harsh policies of Trump. So I think, and some of them because of the Modi-Trump bonhomie, some of them because of the perception that Trump is, stands against radical Islam, some of them because Trump seems to be, ready for a big dust up with China. Although, as I said, actually Trump is probably going to be has been less effective against China than a Biden administration would be. But perceptions matter, right? For lay voters, they are not foreign policy specialists. They see here is a president who is like, punching the Chinese in the eye. and calling them all kinds of names, and saying we will teach the Chinese a lesson, and we hold them accountable, China virus, this and that. So I think there is an element of Indian Americans who will go with Trump this time. Probably the Republicans will do better with Indian Americans than in any previous election, but that doesn't mean they're getting the majority of the Indian American votes. So overall, I think it's good for us also, because Ambassador Meera Shankar was there for the last 20 years. We've been mobilizing the Indian Americans to be a very important lobby for us and for Indian national interests. So if their relative value as a voting bloc or a group, although it's not a homogeneous, we just discussed not homogeneous, but still as a community to be wooed and to be seen as one category, that itself I think will help us in our long-term foreign policy goals, because we have organized them very well. We have mobilized them very well from here, from Yoga Day to important bills to Kashmir to, Balochistan, on every issue that matters to India's core national security and territorial integrity and, broader interests. They are the ones who are like our frontline warriors there in America. And I think you can expect that they will do more of it, whether it is a Trump or a Biden administration, as a result of this changing demographic patterns. So they're above average income, they're higher, they're more professional, most of them are higher educated, and I don't think they have faced as much of the white lash or backlash that the other minority groups have faced under Trump. So if you put all these together, I think they are looking at healthier days. I mean, their unemployment rate, by the way, of Indian Americans is not high compared to the rest of the Americans who've been hit hard by the pandemic, because they're mostly a lot of them in service sector, and they're working from home, online, a lot of them carrying on and earning their big bucks. So I think we can safely say, the ideal was always that our community in America should be as powerful, as influential as the Jewish lobby. I think we're going to get there, whether it is Trump or Biden, as a result of these underlying structural changes that are happening.
Great. Thank you so much. One last word from Ambassador Shankar. Do you think we'd ever have a repeat of Ahmedabad or Houston with Biden and, shall we say, Modi?
I don't know. I don't know whether we would have a repeat. But you remember the first Madison Square hearing that Modi held was during Obama's time. And let's not forget that Modi had a good relationship, had built a very good equation with President Obama in the early period of his tenure, and in fact initially had to face some hostility from Trump and some getting around and getting over, because he was seen as too close to Obama by Trump. So I think these are things that the relationship will now learn to handle. And there is a certain steadying factor in the relationship, which is our strategic convergence and the comfort level, in a sense, that both countries have in dealing with each other, because there's no fundamental conflict of interest.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. It was so enlightening. I really enjoyed it. And I think our viewers will benefit enormously from this conversation. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveri.
Thank you. We'll come back to you after the results.
Okay.
Thank you.